Joining us for today's conversation is State Representative Vikki Goodwin. Representative Goodwin, it is so good to have you with us today.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
So for those who don't know her, Representative Goodwin is the representative from House District 47, which is in the Austin area. And for those of us in the office, the most important part of your bio, I think, is that you're an LBJ school alum, since we have several here. So I'm glad to share that heritage with you.
Absolutely. Great school.
Yes, hook 'em horns, right? So one of the things that was really important for Texans of faith during this legislative session, and we were talking about it before we started recording, is common sense gun reform, is ending gun violence. And this is an area that you worked really hard on during this legislative session, working a lot on practical solutions that had broad support among Texans throughout the state. Yeah. So the first question I like to ask people is, why, out of all of the issues that you can choose to put your energy in, why is this one so important to you?
Well, this one's really important to so many Texans. It's particularly important to me because I have experienced losing a loved one to gun violence. My dad was shot and killed in our home in 1990. So it's been a long time, but I understand that loss, that sudden loss and tragedy. And so I want to keep other people from having to go through that same experience.
And I think we were talking before we started recording that probably everybody listening has some kind of story now. It might not be that they lost a loved one, but I was talking about the fear my daughters felt in school several times this session when they had the lockdown drills or when she got locked in a bathroom. It seems like everybody is experiencing this at some level now, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I hear it all the time. Even from the very first time I started running for office, I would talk to a teacher who said she has a student who won't sit with his back to the door because he wants to be able to see if a shooter comes in the door of the classroom. You know, I just hear stories like that all the time. And so it's something that, even though it's a very hard issue to work on, because in Texas, we have this gun culture, I keep working at it because I also believe that we have a love of our children. And so that love of our children should overcome this gun culture that says that we should be able to have a gun and carry it around without any training, without any infringement on that right. I think that's, we've gone too far in the direction of saying the Second Amendment trumps every single rational rule that we could have around owning and carrying guns.
Right. We do have that gun culture, and I think many of our listeners will understand that. But if you look at public opinion polls, there is a lot of common sense reforms that a vast majority of Texans would support. So can you talk to us some about some of the significant bills that were presented this session and kind of where they landed?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a couple of bills that I think most people probably don't even realize went somewhere. We got two bills out of the House that I think would have been very beneficial. Of course, I think we need to do a lot more. But One of those bills was a straw purchase bill. There was a story that was run recently about Philadelphia. They have done some research on the crimes committed with guns. Many of those guns were acquired through a straw purchase. So somebody who can't legally get a hold of a gun, they go to someone who can and ask them to buy a gun for them. So it's a federal law. You can't do that. However, federal laws are enforced by ATF, and ATF isn't actively pursuing those cases necessarily in the state of Texas. So if we pass a state law, then our local law enforcement can go after that crime. And so that bill, the straw purchase bill, was carried by Representative Ryan Guillen, who is the chairman of the committee that heard the bills.
Right.
It made it out of the House. However, it did get amended when it was in the House. One of the members, Representative Schaefer, didn't like the idea that we were going to look at federal law in terms of who can purchase a gun. So the amendment said that we're only going to look at state law, which is a little less strict. And so it went that way to the Senate. The Senate didn't like the amendment. In fact, in talking to the author of the bill, he said that the lieutenant governor didn't like the amendment. He wanted it based on federal law. And so therefore they stripped the amendment in the Senate, sent it back to the House, and the Representative Schaefer, who didn't like that, said that he had a point of order that would have killed the bill. And so essentially they were never able to work out their differences on the bill, which is very unfortunate because it's not that it didn't have support. It did have support. And I think had it passed, I think the governor might have even signed it into law.
Right. All right. So straw purchase was certainly one. What were some other ones that you had an eye on?
The other one that made it out of the House is one that was brought by a Dallas police officer to ban Glock switches, which are just mechanisms you can add to a gun that makes it fire rapidly. And it made it out of the House. Of course, we tried to amend our Raise the Age bill to that. So the Raise the Age bill is the bill that all of the Uvalde families were advocating for, not allowing an 18, 19, or 20-year-old to be able to buy a semi-automatic rifle. So we tried to amend his Glock switch bill with the Raise the Age bill, and that caused some controversy. I think when it reached the Senate, they didn't want to deal with the same situation happening over there, so they never gave it a hearing. So
those are the two that moved to the House. Talk to us some about some of your other priorities that you hoped would make it through committee, or even made it through committee and didn't get a hearing in the House.
Yeah, so I have continually tried to pass a background check bill. Right now, I think most people feel like everybody has to go through a background check when they buy a gun, but there's a lot of exceptions to that, some loopholes. And so my bill would essentially say anytime you're transferring a gun from one individual to another, it has to go through a background check unless you're family members. So husband to wife, father to son, that sort of thing would be the only exception. So that one got a hearing, but just didn't have enough support to get out of committee even. I had a narrower bill that would also close the loophole. Currently, if you have a handgun license, you get the handgun license and you go through a background check at that time. But then let's say you commit an assault. Then DPS is going to put you on a list of people who can't currently buy a gun until a certain time frame expires or they resolve the issue. Right now, you could still take your handgun license that you got before you committed the assault. Now you've committed assault. You're on a list that says you shouldn't be able to buy a gun.
Right.
But you still have that license. You go into a certain store, and there's no law that says they have to run that license through a database. But DPS does keep a database, and many gun sellers will run the number on your license just to make sure you're not on the revoked or suspended list. But my thought was, let's make that law, and so make sure every gun seller is running the license through the database, making sure they're selling to people who should be able to have a gun.
And so that one got a hearing, but then was left pending in committee?
Well, got a hearing. It did actually get out of committee. We got the votes.
Okay.
It got out of committee, but it sat in the calendar committee. So, it made it a little further than my background check bill, but it didn't make it all the way.
Another one that made it out of committee and kind of a similar fate, I guess it made it through calendars and was scheduled, was the Raise the Age bill, right?
Right. And that one took a lot of effort to get it out of committee because the chairman wasn't willing to bring it up to a vote, and he had determined he was not going to bring it up to a vote in committee. But then we had the mass shooting in Allen, Texas, and that the Monday following that mass shooting, a number of us were prepared to give speeches on the House floor. I think they wanted to avoid that a lot of controversy on the floor, and they kept us from giving those speeches by saying we'll give the bill a vote in committee. So within a couple of hours from that, we took the vote, and it did pass. We had 2 Republicans that voted for it, but the chairman of the committee, Chairman Gann, and the chairman of Calendars Committee, Dustin Burrows, both voted against the bill. And so you can imagine if the chairman of the Calendars Committee voted against the bill, it wasn't likely to get to the floor.
Right. And that one was a really heavy lift, I feel like, to get that one through committee. We were recording, I'm looking at our producer, Davey, to confirm. I think it was the Thursday or Friday before that deadline where it was voted out of committee, and had some folks from Texas Gun Sense and other advocates, some families talking about how insulting it was that bill wouldn't even get a vote in committee, right? And so there were a lot of feelings and a lot of advocacy that went on around that. Can you talk to us some about why and how that advocacy impacted the process, how those victims' families, those Uvalde families who kept showing up and advocating, allowed it to take a step that I think many people thought it wouldn't get to?
Absolutely. I mean, who could possibly say no to those families who kept coming to the Capitol? It's several hours driving up. It's taking the day off work. It's coming and pouring their hearts out. So who possibly could not give them a vote on the one thing that they were most wanting, the raise the age bill? Obviously, there were some representatives who still believe their districts aren't in favor of the change. Representative Gann being one of them. But I think the vast majority, in fact, one of the Republicans that voted for the bill, he said that he felt like if it had reached the floor, that it would have passed. So I think the personal stories from the Uvalde families touched a lot of members. They felt like, gosh, I can imagine I've had a fourth grader at one point in time, or have one, or have a grandchild, or whatever. We all know what it feels like to love a child, and just the fact that so many kids died, and these families were willing to come and testify and try to make change, I think impacted a lot of people.
It didn't just impact or move representatives. Like every time I'd watch those hearings, right? Like it motivated me to continue to work on this. And, as somebody who has 2 children still in public schools, like every time I heard those stories, I pictured my own kids. I think the important thing to remember for a lot of advocates, folks were really disappointed that bill didn't make it to the finish line, but we've both seen far too, it takes session after session after session for bills to become law, oftentimes. And so this was an important first step, but the work continues, right? So for people who care about these issues, why is it important to engage during the interim? What kind of conversations would you be having with elected representatives and candidates for office over the course of the next year and a half if you want these bills to move?
During the interim is super important to be talking to legislators about what they will do the next session. The more they hear from constituents, the more they're going to understand this is an issue that's very important to my electorate. If I want to get reelected, or, I just want to support my community. I am curious if the communities where the members voted against that bill, how they feel. And so hopefully they will reach out to their representative, to their senator, to the governor even, because we have to have that be a priority of our top leadership. The governor, lieutenant governor, and speaker have a lot of power. The speaker can choose a chairman of a committee that will either move a bill or not move a bill. And so really, while talking to your own representative is super important, it's also important to talk to the leadership of the state.
I ask advocates all the time what the most effective way to reach out to representatives would be. But here, you're sitting right here. I feel like you're a perfect person to ask. What's the best way for constituents to build that relationship, to tell their story to their representatives? And I'm going to add candidates for office in that as well.
Sure. Face-to-face is always the best, because when you're looking at somebody, it's really hard to tell them no.
Right.
So that's always the best. But I think phone calls and emails and letters, whichever, everybody's got a different comfort zone. And so, like, if you are good at doing emails, that's maybe the best way to reach your representative or a candidate for office. But certainly being face-to-face with somebody and saying, here's what I care about, here's what I want you to care about as my representative or potential future representative, this is what I want you to work on. They will have to tell you right then and there to your face whether they agree with that or not.
And I assume, especially on this topic, but probably every other topic, stories are maybe the best way to communicate that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think stories are always more touching than statistics and data. We try to base our laws on data and what makes the most sense for the larger population. But still, I think that personal stories always have a really big impact.
Yeah. Speaking of ending gun violence, if people really care about that, and knowing what you just went through during the course of the last 140-day regular session, what's the messaging that you would be taking to those conversations?
I think people should decide what do they think would be the most effective. Is it background checks on all gun sales? Then I think people should be specific. Sure, tell your personal story, why this matters to you if you have a kid in school or what have you, but then follow up with what is the specific solution that you think would solve the problem. Background checks, a waiting period. So sometimes we forget that more gun deaths happen by suicide than homicide. And I think in suicide, having a waiting period on gun purchases might minimize that issue.
Right.
And so, for some people, it may be the background check. Someone else, it might be more important to have the waiting period. So I think expressing what specific legislative change you're looking for is important.
Right. Anything we're missing in terms of ending gun violence you want to make sure you say to our listeners before we close out today?
Well, I also believe it's really important to join an organization that's working on the issue that's important to you, Texas Impact, Texas Gun Sense. That way, when they are following the issue very closely, or you're following the issue very closely, you can let your organization members know today is the day to send that email, or today is the day that this is coming up to the committee hearing. I think it's important because as individuals, sometimes people aren't as aware of how the process works and what timing is the right timing. So I think joining an organization that's already working on an issue that you're passionate about is really important.
I appreciate that. Thank you. I always love getting a good plug from a representative on air. So thank you. Any shameless plugs you want to leave us with today?
Well, and then, of course, my office also does some training. We try to teach people the best way to advocate, and we do that a couple of times a year. We had one early in session, and my staff put it on. They kind of show people around the Capitol, because it can be intimidating coming to the Capitol.
Right.
Where do you park? How do you get to the hearing rooms? The Capitol is like a maze.
It is that, yes.
And we also say, if unfortunately the way our hearings are done, you might have 10 items on the agenda. It starts at 8 a.m., but you may not actually testify until 8 p.m., the way our hearings are done.
Or later.
Or later. So we always offer my office for them to come and rest and relax. And so just giving them a tour of the Capitol, showing them where the kiosks are. Some people aren't comfortable with the actual testimony, but they can register their support or opposition for bills, letting them know where different things are in the Capitol and just how the process works, we've heard is very helpful. So we do that a couple of times a year, and you can reach out to us and find out when the next one will be. Through my email, which is vikki.goodwin@house.texas.gov, or just Google me. You can find me.
Absolutely. Well, Representative Goodwin, I really appreciate your work during the legislative session. I know we had a chance to connect at the Ending Gun Violence prayer breakfast that one of our teams put on. And I could just tell how passionate you were about this issue and so many others. So I really appreciate the work you did during the legislative session and really appreciate you taking the time today. So thanks for all you do.
Well, absolutely. Thank you for working on this issue.